Hi, we're going to talk today about medieval history, that is, the history of the European Middle Ages. Let's set dates. Now, our discussion will discuss, if time allows, our discussion will include the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. So let's say roughly the dates 1100 to 1600. So 500 years. Okay. The dating of the Middle Ages is a difficult thing, but let's just take as our date 1100. What we know as Europe came into existence around 1100. Before that time, we had a brief glimmer under Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus Charlemagne, who was a Frank, the king of the Franks, a Germanic tribe, barbarian tribe as we say, had prospered around the year 800. In the year 800, he was crowned emperor of Europe, basically, by the Pope. That was full of significance, and that date, that event is very important because it established political authority of the Vatican, of the Pope. It said that after allowing himself to be crowned in 800, in fact Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne realized that he had made a great mistake, because by allowing himself to be crowned, he was recognizing a higher temporal earthly power than his own, namely that of the Vatican. Anyway, Charlemagne and his successors, especially the Ottonian emperors, established and held on to the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, as it said. Meanwhile, France was developing rapidly, and France would be the great rival to the Holy Roman Empire in political terms in Europe during the entire period that we're talking about too. Okay, so what's happening around 1100? Unlike other periods, some other periods anyway, we can't say that something happened in 1100, some event that was a landmark around which we can organize other things. We can talk about tendencies. The tendency was, one of the large tendencies was urbanization, that is, the growth and development of cities. What really this means is the development of a middle class, a bourgeoisie, a middle class, a commercial class. Without the middle class, there are no cities. With the development of the middle class, the other main tendency historically is the development of nationalism, that is, the national state. Now, these two tendencies might represent opposite tendencies later on, but for the time being, they are the same tendency. The development of cities means the development of financial power. Kings will harness that power in order to establish central governments, and central governments mean the establishment of the national state. Okay. At the same time as cities are developing, it's not surprising that universities develop. Universities belong to cities. Until recent times, Americans, universities developed in cities. The growth of industries, universities, beginning probably in Bologna, in Italy, and Padua. There are rivals because it's difficult to date these things. The University of Paris, soon after, the University of Oxford University soon after. Anyway, cities and industries and national states developing quickly. Excuse me. So, the rival that looms behind all this and wants to claim its share of power is the Church. By the Church is meant, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church reaches its zenith of power, it's usually said, in the early 13th century, that is, the years 1200 to 1215. As many other things, let's discuss this for a while. As in many other matters, when something temporal of time of this earth reaches its zenith, its high point, it's already on the way down. And this is certainly true of the Roman Catholic Church. Its authority was so great, its spiritual authority was so great, from 1100 to 1215. Mostly good popes, intelligent in a political sense, but also spiritually exalted people, held the position during that 12th century, the 1100s. Within the church, the Cluniac movement, centered in Cluny in southern France, south-central France, became the center of the monastic system of churches, which extended all the way from Santiago de Compostela on the coast of the Atlantic coast, all the way to, let's say, Hungary in the east, all the way from Sicily to northern Germany. This network of monasteries, all belonging, not all, but mostly belonging to the same order, the Cluniac order, Cluny, represented the power of the church. Now, what does the power of the church mean? It meant that the church owned a lot of land, and land was power. The church held this land under the authority of the Vatican. Excuse me. And although the aristocrats and kings didn't like it, they basically felt awe, A-W-E, felt awe before the Vatican, because the Vatican seemed to be God's voice, God's power. After all, the Vatican, for those of you who don't know it, was centered there in Rome, in Vatican City. The Pope was presumably the vicar of the church. The Pope traced the papacy traced its authority back to Saint Peter. Saint Peter was the first pope by tradition. Well, that's huge power, because Christ had said, Christ had given the keys to the kingdoms, apparently, to Saint Peter, and this meant that Saint Peter, or his vicar, or his successor, held the power of eternal life for Christians, including kings. That is, the church had the power of damnation or salvation, offering damnation or salvation to people, including kings. Well, the belief in this was still pretty strong, and even those kings who were, and emperors who were intelligent enough to question this, could not openly question it, could not openly go against the authority of the church, because the great majority of their citizens and their subjects, the subjects of these kings and emperors, believed totally in the authority of the church. A couple of very sharp people, one in the 12th century and one in the 13th century, certainly tried to oppose this power. One was Henry II of England, who was a Plantagenet from southern France, that is a Norman, because the Norman invasion had taken place in 1066. So the Normans sat on the throne of England and were the Dukes of Normandy in northern France. Henry opposed the power of the church in England. If you ever have a chance to see a great movie, a great film, Becket, I hope you do, with Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, absolutely great. It shows Henry II's attempt to put a puppet in the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the most was and is the most powerful ecclesiastical position, church position in England. So Henry, who had been opposed by the church again and again, thought he had his chance to solve all his problems by putting a friend of his, Becket, Thomas Becket or Thomas Ab Becket, in the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury. But what happens is that the position transforms Becket from a worldly, somewhat cynical man to a spiritually hungry man who feels the weight and the power and the importance, the spiritual importance of that position, Archbishop of Canterbury. And in the end, opposes his king, doesn't help him, opposes him. The king has him murdered, but it costs him greatly and sets back the English throne in its struggle against the power of the church for a century. That's a typical example of what happened when a temporal ruler, a king, opposed the ecclesiastical power of the church. Couldn't happen, not with success. The second example I said I would mention is the Emperor Frederick II, Hohenstaufen Emperor, that is a German emperor. Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, as he was called, the marvel of the world. Remarkable man, living between about 1190 and about 1250. That is, during his lifetime, the church reaches its peak and starts to go down. Frederick spent most of his time in Sicily, where he was absolute ruler, but he was the Holy Roman ruler, when the Holy Roman Emperor had a lot of power. He opposed the papacy, the Pope, too. Actually went to battle against the Pope. But in the end he lost because of it. His people, who admired him and feared him a lot, and his intelligence was great, and his charisma was great, nevertheless, by going against the church, he brought himself nearly to ruin. So this is what was happening. Now, I realize I'm talking about the church, but the church reaches, as I said, its time of glory during our period. Now, early in the 1200s, here's what happens. Why is this the peak years? Because during this time, this is the lifetime of St. Francis. St. Francis lives from about 1180 to 1226, our period. A second amazing man, St. Dominic, almost the same dates as St. Francis. Well, these men were the founders of the two most powerful church orders of priests and monks. Cluny had fallen. The Franciscan order of monks and the Dominican order of monks. The Pope, Innocent III, I think, who was intelligent enough to see what St. Francis was and who this person was, when this madman came to Rome with his followers, all educated men, and danced around and sang the glory of God in their poor robes their poverty, because they had embraced poverty with St. Francis, this Pope was intelligent enough to see that by opposing these men, he would hurt the church. By accepting these men as part of the church, he would assert his own and the church's authority over them, and thus absorb this revolutionary movement rather than try to oppose it stupidly. But it took a lot of insight to embrace the Franciscans. It took a lot of insight to realize that these men were potentially revolutionaries who could have challenged the Vatican completely. After all, the Vatican was a very wealthy place. The cardinals and archbishops and bishops of the church were princes. They lived in palaces. Their wealth was vast. And along comes St. Francis, who embraced as an ideal dame poverty, he said, because in his opinion, a follower of Christ should embrace poverty, not wealth. Well, this was a slap in the face to the Vatican, but in the peak years, Innocent III, I think, recognized the implications of the Franciscan movement, accepted the Franciscans, and the Franciscan order became a very rich and powerful order within the church. The Dominicans became the scholars of the church. Later the Franciscans were too. In fact, pretty soon. But at first the scholars were the Dominicans. St. Dominic was a scholar. But now we can see why I say that the peak of the church and the beginning of a long decline, a long painful decline, happened at the same time. In southern France, a heretical movement, southern France and northern Italy, the richest parts of Europe, the cities of southern France, of Provence, and northern Italy, especially Milano, very wealthy. In that area, that large area, a heretical order, a heretical movement began. These were called the Cathars, or in southern France, the Albigensians. They were a heresy because basically they taught and believed in principles that opposed the traditional values of the church. Roughly speaking, we can say they were dualistic. A dualistic dualism in anything means recognizing two forces, two sources of power, two authorities. Dualism in religion is dangerous business. Dualism means, in this context, that God's power is not God is not omnipotent. That there's a second principle of power in the universe. For the Cathars, who were very similar to the Manichees of earlier times, for the Cathars there were two principles at work: light and darkness, good and evil. Secondly, the Cathars recognized predestination. That is, God predestined certain souls to be saved, the elect. This principle would later be used by Calvin and the Calvinists in the Reformation. The idea here is, if God has so much power, he must know in advance everything that we're doing, everything that we're going to do. Therefore, he must have chosen certain people to be good and others to be damned. Okay. One consequence of this is, for some people draw the conclusion, I'm not saved, I'm not a good person, therefore I may as well have a nice time, a good time here in this world. And this happened in southern France. Again, so what are we talking about? The Church, the Vatican, decided that it could not tolerate these Albigensians, these heretics, even though they were in such a rich and powerful area of Europe. And so the Vatican appointed St. Dominic and his Dominicans early in the 13th century, around 1200, to go to these areas and preach against the heretics and save these souls. The preaching did some good, but not enough, and so it was followed by armies. And the Albigensian Crusade, which is an embarrassment to the church, took place during the years about 1204 to 1226, the very years we're talking about. 1226, the year of Francis's death. What happened? Armies from northern France, serving the Vatican, invaded southern France. Basically, the northern French armies were jealous of the southern French and wanted to reduce their power and take their wealth. So this was not a pretty religious thing at all. As always in such matters, secular interests prevailed in what were supposed to be spiritual matters. What an embarrassment. The church hiring an army to fight and kill, lay siege to, and massacre populations like Montségur in southern France. This is an eternal embarrassment to the church. In the end, the church won, if you can call it winning, and that really supports my point. At the same time as they won, they lost. This was terrible. Very embarrassing. Another huge embarrassment during this time was the Third Crusade, 1204. Just during this very time. The Crusades had begun in 1095. There were 7 main crusades. The Crusades were attempts, supposedly, to recapture the Holy Land, Palestine, from the infidel, meaning the Muslims, so that it would be a part of Christendom, Christianity. Well, the idea was corrupt from the start. There were, of course, economic reasons for this. Overpopulation was one, bear that in mind. Already by 1095, overpopulation of Europe. Wow. Also, too many aristocrat families having several sons. The oldest son inherited everything, so what happened to the younger sons? Normally they received an education, very often went into the church. But generally this was not a very satisfying deal, except for some. Okay, the Crusades. The Third Crusade was a very embarrassing thing for the church. It was led by the Venetians, Venice, the richest town in Europe at the time. The Venetians were very glad to support this crusade with money, because what they had in mind was crushing some of the power of Constantinople. Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, as it was called, the Byzantine Empire, was the big rival of the Venetians in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Venetians saw this crusade, this holy crusade, as a chance to, with God's blessing, fight and what shall we say, subjugate, conquer these Christians, but they were not Roman Catholic Christians. They were what we can call Greek Orthodox, that is the Eastern Church. The Venetians had this chance in 1204, and they took it. First, of course, there were many other soldiers, not just the Venetians. It was the Venetian ships who transported these armies. First, they stopped on the Dalmatian coast in what is now Yugoslavia. They conquered a city there, massacred its people, not all, but massacred thousands, and plundered and looted. But that was just preparation for the big stop. The big stop was Constantinople. Still probably the richest city in the world at this time, except for maybe Baghdad. in Muslim country. Constantinople, this old, very rich capital, was sacked for the first time in its history by fellow Christians, not by the Muslims, by the Christians, by these Christian armies of crusaders. It took them 10 days to sack everything they could. Fortunately, a lot was left over. The wealth of the city was so huge. And they raped and killed people, and this is after breaking down the walls. Well, what an embarrassment. What an embarrassment. I don't remember, I'm not even sure that the Third Crusade ever even arrived in Palestine. After all, they had already accomplished what they wanted, the Venetians wanted, by crippling the power of their rival in the Eastern Mediterranean. This made it much more possible for the Ottoman Turks to finally finish off Constantinople, but Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, continued until 1453. You see what I mean now about the beginning of the 13th century being at the same time the zenith, the peak, the apex of glory for the church, and the beginning of its long, long decline. Not that the elements of decline and decay and corruption weren't evident long before. After all, any earthly institution is going to be corrupt and have plenty of things to be embarrassed about. The fact is that the most successful institution in the history of the world has been the Catholic Church. And no institution, I assume, will ever have a more glorious history than the Catholic Church. But, of course, a lot to be embarrassed about. Okay, let's advance into the 13th century some more, then. What we can expect to see is the further development of national states. By the way, during those same years, 1200 to 1220, let's say, France had its first really great national king, Philippe Auguste, and that's typical of what I mean. He challenged the church several times, but he was a very clever man, so he never put himself on a real collision course with the church. Okay, so the church, the growth of cities, the growth of national states, especially France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, a big rival. Now, let's move to the end of the 13th century and discuss Dante, because Dante is, in a sense, the crowning glory of the Middle Ages, in literature, certainly. I'm skipping a little too fast. In the same period, the beginning of the 13th century, this is the beginning of the glory of the Gothic, high Gothic architecture. The greatest churches in Christendom, without exception, I think, were begun during that same period, 1190 to 1240, let's say. This Gothic movement began in the Ile-de-France, that area in the center of France, well, north center, around Paris. That's where it began. From the start, it was associated with the French kings, French royalty, and its glory was immense and still is. I mean, the greatest cathedrals in the world are still Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Notre Dame, to the south a little bit, Bourges, Clermont. No churches rival these. The Italians, frankly, don't rival them. St. Peter is no rival for these. The English have some pretty good ones, but they're not serious rivals to the High French Gothic. This is the glory of, one could almost say this is the glory of European architecture. What's greater? Combining the beauties of architecture and sculpture and stained glass, all built to the glory of God, all the church. What an amazing thing. All at the same time reaching its peak in glory. Remarkable. Anyway, moving to Dante. While moving to Dante, we move past the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas dies in 1250. His master, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, the scholastic, so-called scholastic philosophers, accomplished an amazing thing, and the Church still, the Catholic Church still relies heavily on the Thomists and the scholastics. What did St. Thomas Aquinas try to do? Aquinas was an Italian, a brilliant philosopher. He tried to combine Christianity and Aristotle. Aristotle was the prince of philosophers. Plato's glory would arrive soon, but Aristotle was the prince of philosophers. Everyone recognized this, and perhaps still does, really, to some extent. What Thomas wanted to accomplish then was to establish a philosophical theology. The idea was this: is religion based at all on reason, or is it purely based on revelation? The medieval admirers of Aristotle, especially, and the philosophers in general, didn't want to allow Christianity, Christian doctrine, to rest entirely on faith. Faith and reason. Revelation and philosophy. This was the idea. And Thomas managed to blend then classical antiquity, represented by Aristotle, and Christian doctrine and revelation. And he accomplished a lot. He attempted to prove the existence of God. His famous 5 ways are impressive. He himself recognized, though, that there was no proving the existence of God by logic. In fact, by the way, as a side note, the attempt to prove the existence of God could be taken as a high expression of the Church, but it's also a confession of the inadequacy of faith. And this is trouble, because this will bring religion down, and to a certain extent it has brought religion down, Christianity. I'll repeat my little notion here. My notion is that the attempts to prove God's existence by reason are a confession of the inadequacy of faith. It's a confession of inadequacy, I'm afraid. Historically, this has been borne out, it seems to me. Anyway, so the high glory is also decline, once again. Okay, so that's what Aquinas did. Now Dante. Dante, wonderful genius, highest expression of the Middle Ages in literature. But paradoxically, he also points ahead to the future in some key moments. I guess I have to discuss Dante. That's going to slow us way down, Dr. Shin. But his importance is so huge, I'll just get as far as we can. The Divine Comedy. Dante's dates: 1265, 1321. Florence, the most glorious city of the Middle Ages, by the 14th century, certainly. 13th and 14th century. The glory of Italy, in a way, more glorious than Rome, but also strangely crippling Italy. Because such a glorious place as Florence, and another as Venice, and another as Rome, and another as Milan, prevented the Italians from achieving national unity at a time when the other national states were achieving national unity. And this then meant that the national states were, not easily, but were certainly more powerful than these great cities, and came to Italy and established their power in Italy. The Spaniards, the Holy Roman Empire, the French, the Normans even. Anyway, Dante. What a wonderful place Florence is, and arguably Florence was the new Athens. A town with 30,000 people, just like ancient Athens, citizens, reaching heights over about 150 years that Athens reached. Not quite as great, but very great. And the first really great son of Florence, Dante. Okay. Early in his life, Dante saw from a distance a girl who was a little younger than he was, and basically from a different social class, a little higher. Dante was poor nobility. Anyway, this girl, Beatrice, he, as time went by, he came to regard her as the incarnation of grace, kind of, for him. That is, she was beautiful, but he idealized her in the tradition of southern France, courtly love, Albigensian Crusade, remember? The Cathars, those heretics. They had developed this tradition of courtly love, chivalry. In literature, by the way, earlier than Dante, the greatest expression of these were the medieval romances, the Arthurian legends, Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, all of them. Some great literature there. Chrétien de Troyes was the greatest of those poets, but they cannot be compared with Dante, so we'll just see them as earlier lights before Dante. But Dante used their ideals, chivalry, the adoration of woman. This, by the way, goes back to Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the first half of the 12th century. Perhaps I should have begun with him, since we started this with 1100. The year 1100, Saint Bernard, the greatest figure in Europe in the first half of the 12th century. Bernard, among other things, glorified the Virgin Mary. The cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary begins with Saint Bernard, heavily influenced by that southern French movement of courtly love, the adoration of the perfect woman. And it's true sometimes they wanted to seduce her, these poets, but they also wanted to adore from afar and be exalted, be raised up by these beautiful women's influence. And their beauty was not just physical. They had to be, by the way, aristocrats. The background of that is that very often the husbands were away fighting the Crusades, leaving their wives in positions of power and authority in especially southern France. This had a lot to do with the rise of status of women, and then Saint Bernard making Mary, suddenly lowly Mary, who was never all that significant, the Queen of Heaven, suddenly. All this transformed the role and importance of women, historically, tremendously in Europe. Dante represents the culmination of this whole movement. His Beatrice, his ideal. Okay, let me tell you about the Divine Comedy. It's about 15,000 lines, so it's roughly the same length as the Iliad, a little longer than the Odyssey, and it deserves to be put in their company. Okay, Dante, the main character in the Divine Comedy, is Dante Pilgrim. He's called Dante Pilgrim because he's Dante, but he's not Dante. Dante uses himself, tells his own story, this vision or experience that he had on Easter weekend, 1300, covering Easter week. Amazing thing. At the beginning of the story, Dante says that he was lost in the dark woods representing sin, error, despair, hopelessness, going the wrong way. He wanders through the dark woods, sees a hill or a mountain, starts to climb this mountain, salvation maybe, and is opposed by these three beasts, the wolf, the leopard, and the lion. They represent certain sins. Dante is desperate, he said, and suddenly Virgil, his hero, the Roman poet, dead long ago, appears to him and says, I've been sent to you to help you, sent by Beatrice in paradise, with the blessing of the Virgin Mary. I will help you if you're willing to be helped, says Virgil to Dante, and I will lead you through the realm of hell. I will lead you then, if you want to be led, through the realm of purgatory, purgatorio, and if you want to go beyond that, someone else will lead you, because I can't. I'm in hell because I was a pagan. I didn't know Christian hope. Someone else will lead you through paradise. Dante says, you're my hero, you're my guide, I will follow you anywhere. And this adventure begins. The symmetry and structure of the Divine Comedy set it apart from any other major work of literature. Reason is in control of this very structured adventure, far more structured again than any other work of literature. Dante had studied Aquinas and the scholastics. Dante knew his Christian theology, and he gave it expression, poetic expression, in his poem, his long poem. Okay, we have the first canto, or poem, about 150 lines, each canto. The entire work is made up of 100 canti, or cantos. In the first one he's lost, and Virgil comes to him. Then follow 33 cantos of hell, inferno, 33 of purgatory, purgatorio, and 33 of paradiso, paradise. 33, 33, 33, 100. Wow, what amazing symmetry. And each individual cantica, hell, purgatory, and paradise, is divided into sections, mostly 7 sections, 10 if you count another way. The number 10 everywhere, the number 100 dominating the whole poem. The number 10, the perfect number, because it's 3 squared plus 1 to represent the unity. 3 squared 9 plus 1 10 everywhere. 3, why 3? Because the Holy Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, dominating everything. On and on, it's endless, the complexity, but the clarity and symmetry of this poem. So Dante, led by Virgil, enters hell. Down, down, down he goes, from ledge to ledge to ledge, to the center of earth. Because what is hell? Hell was created when Satan, in his rebellion, Lucifer, fell in his war against God, hit earth and created this region, hell, of course. And there he is at the bottom of hell, in the center of earth. And of course he's at the center of hell. He is the prince of evil, the prince of lies. Hell is his creation, and we, if we want to spend eternity there, according to the church, reject God, reject the church and its grace, and there will be too. Dante talks with people as he goes through hell, level by level by level. And as he goes through hell and purgatory and paradise, Dante Pilgrim grows. At first he's very foolish. He says and does stupid things. Virgil treats him like a child because Virgil represents reason. Virgil represents reason. And Virgil scolds Dante and frowns at him and scolds him and lectures him throughout Inferno and Purgatory. Virgil schools Dante. Virgil is reason. But reason can only guide one so far. Reason can guide one to the end of Purgatory, but reason cannot save us in the end and lead us into paradise. The poem is a vast allegory. An allegory is a symbolic poem, a symbolic work in which every piece, every part, presumably, represents something else symbolically. Dante Pilgrim represents something else. He's man, a man who is lost and who is saved by the intervention of grace, by the grace of God, through the Virgin Mary, who is behind all this, though God ultimately is behind, and so forth and so on. The development of Dante Pilgrim is one of the masterpieces of the poem, but the poem has so many aspects, so complex and yet so readable, entertaining, wonderful. Okay, so Dante reaches the center of hell. What does this mean? This means that Dante Pilgrim has acquired a profound knowledge of what evil is. Step by step by step, he realizes more and more what evil really is. The rejection of God, the rejection of hope, faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love, God. The three theological virtues. By the time he reaches Satan, he is disgusted and angry at himself and at evil, and this is the way it should be. Then he reascends with Dante the back alley, let's say, of Earth, because he's reached the center of Earth. He's got to go back to the surface. And the last word of the Inferno, as of the other two sections, the last word of each of the three sections, stelle, the stars, it's one of 1,000 details, everything falling into place in this poem. There are imperfections of the poem, of course. There are blunders. But there is so much profundity and interest and charm that it's not equaled except by the Iliad, I would say, as a single work, and by Shakespeare's tragedies together. Okay, so then he begins with Virgil his ascent, climbing of Mount Purgatory, because Mount Purgatory, by far the highest mountain in the world, is in the Western Hemisphere, but in Dante's time no one had traveled to the Western Hemisphere. So that was one reason why no one could travel there, because Mount Purgatory is there, and the church didn't want people exploring out there very much. So Dante and Virgil come to the base of this mountain and start their long ascent. At first, Dante is weighed down by his body, by his sinfulness, now that he understands what's going on, but he's also made lighter because, having learned what evil is, he desires salvation and God. And at first, the ascent is slow and heavy. But in canto after canto, he becomes lighter and lighter, and his ascent becomes faster and faster. But of great interest, he's slowed down in certain sins, certain areas of purgatory where sins are purged. He's slowed down by those sins which Dante, feels that he is most subject to. One was lust, for example. One was anger. These are the classic Dantesque sins, especially anger. All of this immensely interesting. And through Purgatory, long lectures by Virgil, who becomes a philosopher, a real philosopher in Purgatory. It's the most philosophical of the three sections of the poem. And, of course, Dante Pilgrim becomes a philosopher too. By the end of Purgatory, actually the 30th canto, there are 33, remember? Dante has his wonderful farewell from Virgil as he, Dante, enters the earthly paradise. What is earthly paradise but at the very top of Mount Purgatory? It's Eden, the Eden that we lost at the beginning of time through sin. Adam's and Eve's sin and our sin with them. Dante regains Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory, his innocence, and here he's left Virgil now. Virgil can't enter this area. Only the Christian with Christian salvation may. Here he has his reunion with Beatrice. Great stuff. Heavily allegorical, so that for modern tastes is the hardest part to appreciate or enjoy. Beatrice shows him some allegories about the church, heavily symbolic allegories about the corruption of the church. Dante, by the way, Dante's poem was put on the forbidden list of poems for a long time by the church, the Index, so-called, because Dante put many popes in hell. Dante was always angry about the corruption and the corruption of the church. The sale of church offices, the sale of salvation even, the sale of money. Dante always angry at the church. No wonder the church was kind of embarrassed by this, the greatest of all Christian works of literature. The church has outgrown some of that now, but that's typical of the church too. The church was embarrassed by Dante's time about its own sins, about its own corruption. And the church tried to reform itself through the 14th and 15th centuries. Not successfully. It required too much, the job was too big. But to its credit, sincere people of the church and leaders knew that the church needed reforming. And they tried several times. At the Council of Basel, the Council of Constance, other councils too, in the 15th century. Back to Dante. At the end of Purgatory, Dante turns his eyes to the stars, of course, and follows Beatrice, and then we have the paradise. Through the 10 circles or spheres of paradise, Dante rises faster and faster as he becomes more and more light, as his understanding of God, his longing for God, his knowledge of God increase, he moves faster and faster until he becomes kind of light, always inspired by and following Beatrice as she guides him through sphere after sphere. The spheres are symbolized in the Purgatory by the planets, that is Mercury. The system, by the way, was the geocentric or Ptolemaic universe, which had the Earth at the center. So Dante was leaving the Earth, leaving Mount Purgatory, of course, and rising. Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Sun, Saturn, Jupiter, then the primum mobile, Aristotelian stuff, which was a theoretical area moved by angels, the most powerful angels, who moved around the universe. Remember, the Earth's at the center. Moved around the universe so fast because they came closest to God. The Trinity was seen as outside, but the source of all, the universe of all life, the angels of the Primo Mobile came closest to God, responding with knowledge and joy, moving faster and faster, and they made the whole universe move. The stars, everything moved, along with the Primo Mobile, Dante rising more and more. Some great, great moments. He has a great conversation with his ancestor, whom he puts, don't remember much, Saturn, I think, and has a great reunion with this man whom he had never known. He's proud of him, though. Dante has great reunions with St. Francis, with St. Dominic, with the heroes of the church, the heroes of the Christian past. Remember, the whole Divine Comedy is basically Dante running into these people as they are placed in various positions, either to be punished in hell, to be saved in purgatory, or already saved, saints, so to speak, in paradise. Finally, we get the crowning glory of this amazing poem as we reach the end. In the last three cantos, Dante is in the sempiternal rose. It turns out that all these spheres, all these planets where Dante had met and talked with various people who were blessed for various reasons, that was all a show for Dante's sake. And now another show, all of those blessed people assume their place in the great rose, symbol of love, courtly love, the Virgin Mary, ultimately God, love always. Dante has this vision of all these saints whom he's already talked to in this rose, and all the souls there enjoy the contemplation of the Godhead, the Christian Trinity, God, which is infinitely powerful, infinitely profound, infinitely beautiful, infinitely satisfying, so that these souls want nothing more than just to contemplate God and praise God's glory and glorify God. Dante is led step by step by Beatrice. Beatrice kind of turns him over toward the end, Saint Bernard, who is, remember, the Virgin Mary's knight, let's call him, glorifier, I guess. Anyways, very moving. Beatrice asks Bernard to help Dante have his vision of the Godhead. How does it go? Bernard then turns his eyes to Mary, of course. Mary turns her eyes to the Godhead. Dante follows from Bernard to Mary to the final vision, following her gaze, looking straight into the Godhead, and has this this most literary of mystical moments, just beyond description. Anyway, for a believer, this is the how can literature, how can anything go beyond this? For the non-believer, it's still great. Speaking for myself, I mean, it's just so beautiful. Of course, it's just a poetic, it's a metaphor in the end. It's just it's an idea. It's an attempt to explain or to find some verbal equivalent to explain the mystical experience, but it's the best in literature, certainly. Anyway, Dante has this final vision, and he looks, at last, he is strong enough and has enough knowledge and understanding and hunger for God to be able to look into the Godhead. He couldn't have done that. It's like looking into the sun. he can look into the sun. And as he looks, he tries to search and understand or experience. These words have no meaning. Understand what? Experience what? His final vision is a human face emerging from the Godhead. This is Christ, the incarnation, but this is kind of a statement that ultimately the ultimate mystery of God is the ultimate mystery of the universe, and somehow it is bound up with man. That God, the mystery of God and the mystery of man are ultimately somehow, and the universe, the same. But words can't carry anyone there, so Dante wakes up from this kind of dream or vision. Was it a dream? Was it a vision? He can't tell us himself. Looking at the stars. Final word, end of the amazing poem. Okay, Dante finished the poem. Even the way that it came down to us is kind of miraculous. Literature has some of these miracle stories. One of them is the preservation of the final cantos of the Divine Comedy. It's said that Dante died, but no one could find the last cantos of the Divine Comedy. Well, what a loss! It's unimaginable to think of an equivalent loss. But according to the legend, he appeared to his son in a dream, told his son where he had hidden the cantos. The son finds the cantos, and God, we have the poem. I don't know why I'm so moved by that. Maybe I didn't get enough sleep, I guess. But well.